Good morning. My name is Colleen Casey, and I'm the owner of Some Art Fabric, a small online fabric company. And like many people, I've been making a lot of masks for folks. While I was making them, I figured out a couple of tips and tricks that I wanted to share that could help other people streamline the process from going to a individual seamstress to a production sewist. This video is an addendum to an existing tutorial that is available at the link below. Please watch that video first and get a good idea of mask making processes, and then come back and check my cutting tips, my tacking tips, and my sewing tips. There are great tutorials up, but some of the steps in the tutorials I found a little challenging for many reasons, including the fact that I can't sit and sew for as long as I used to. I need to get up and move around. So I broke out a few of the steps and I made them steps that I could do away from the sewing machine. Are they faster? No, they're not faster, but they're physically more comfortable for me, and I simply can't do some of these steps at the sewing machine successfully in a way that makes me proud of what I'm sewing. And since my goal is to sew somewhere close to 300 masks, I need to be proud of what I'm doing, and I need to be physically comfortable. So one of the things that you have probably discovered is that to make 100 masks, you have to cut out 100 masks. And when you're handling a lot of fabric and making huge stacks of mask blanks, you have a little bit of extra. And if you know what size you need, you can go ahead and cut strips that are the correct width for what you're going to do later on with your masks, the edging or the straps. If you don't, you end up stacking a bunch of fabric, small bits that you have to go back to and re-straighten later. So while I'm cutting, I cut my blanks, and then whatever's left, I go ahead and cut, for me, 2-inch pieces. That's not what everyone will need, but that is what I use with my masks. Once I finish cutting these, I put them aside and I go and I sew my blanks. This is probably the easiest sewing. Straight stitch, one seam, turn it around, and then press it. The first challenge I had came with making the pleats. I watched a lot of videos of folks who could pleat at the sewing machine and do other things at the sewing machine. That was completely beyond my abilities. I was not capable of pleating at the sewing machine. So I made a small jig for myself, as it were. It's really simple. This is a piece of cardboard bolt, or the end of the cardboard bolt, and I put my sewn blank, so it's been sewn and pressed, and it's ready for its pleats, and I took out my ruler and I did some drawing. I drew a top, and then I measured in approximately an inch, and I made another inch mark. And then I measured a 1/2 inch, another inch mark for the second pleat, a 1/2 inch, another inch mark for the third pleat, and then whatever was left, which was approximately an inch. So to make the pleats, and I needed them to be consistent, I lay my piece of fabric that has been sewn and pressed, and I take my fingernails and I pinch it up and I fold it over and I finger press it. For those of you who are new to sewing and never have heard the term finger press, it just means exactly that. I use my fingers to press. I put my pin in for the first pleat. Well, I wanted things to be consistent, so I needed to be able to take it back to this line right here so that I could find my second pleat really carefully. So then I go to my second pleat. I take my fingernail, I pinch it, I fold it over, I put 2 pins in it. And then to the last pleat. Again, I've moved my mask a little bit, but I have my starting point there so that I can always go back, and I put the top back there, and there's my third pleat, and I can put my third pleat in. Now, I think it's grand if you can do this at the sewing machine, but what I'm discovering is that I can't sit at the sewing machine for hours. So not only does this help me because I get up and I move around and I do something else, but it keeps me consistent. So once you have them pinned, you're able to put this away. Now, if you're pinning one of them, you probably don't want a template. But I'm not pinning one of them. I'm pinning stacks and stacks of them until I run out of straight pins. And then I go to my sewing machine. All right, so if you're new to sewing, you might not know about thread catchers. Thread catchers are just little pieces of fabric that you use to sew on and off of when you are done with a seam. The purpose is so that you don't have to hold the thread behind the way you do when you start, and in theory, it saves thread. I don't know if that's a true statement. All right, so I've sewn this once, and I've sewn the pleats in and the 2 pieces of elastic. I'm going to take my piece of fabric that I've cut for my masks, which is slightly different size than the ones in the pattern. My piece is 2 inches by 4.5, and I'm going to put the right side facing what I'm going to call the back of my mask, behind the elastic and the pleats. You might want a pin or 2. I'm giving myself at least a 1/2 inch on both sides. These are a little longer, so my mask might not be 3.5 inches the way it usually is. And I'm going to come up here and I'm going to sew on a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to come off my thread saver and I'm going to start sewing right at the edge of my piece that's 2 inches. I'm going to stop when I get to my needle, remove my needle, sew over. So this is the second time I've sewn over my elastic. I'm getting a little bit of a ripple here, and that happens. You can either use a chopstick, or they make skewers just for this particular purpose, just to keep my fabric down. Stop. Please stop your sewing machine when you take out pins. Go back to sewing. And I'm going to sew right off the edge. If I were doing an entire stack like I usually am, I would just pick up the next mask, line up my piece of 2 by 4.5 fabric, and continue sewing. Since I'm not, I'm going to use a thread saver. And I'm just going to sew straight onto my thread saver and snip my piece off. And now we're ready to go and glue. So once you go to the sewing machine and you've sewn your 2 end pieces on, the wonderful tutorial that I watched, the woman was able to do all of the edge sewing right there at the machine. Instead of using pins, I'm going to use washable glue. It can be white glue, it can be clear glue. I just have a little bit in this container. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lift this flap, and I'm going to put a little tiny bit of glue. I'm dabbing this glue. I'm not painting this glue. I'm just dabbing it. I'm going to do it on both sides. I'm just going to lift this flap, and I'm going to dab a little bit of glue here. You can use a glue stick, but I don't have a copious amount of glue sticks. I have a copious amount of washable glue. So then you press. If you get glue on your fingers, it will cause your fabric to come up. You press your folded flap right at your sewing line, and then you gently press all the way. See how it's staying for the most part. Go to the other side, press, press, press. It doesn't love to stay right on these 2 corners, but it shouldn't be that big of a deal. I am seeing some threads, and threads kind of bother me, so I'm just going to trim that off. And I'm going to see if I can get just a little bit more glue underneath there. You don't want to get glue all over your project, so just a small amount of glue. Okay, so next step, I'm going to put a little bit more glue right here in my seam allowance. This glue is washable, so the first time the mask gets washed, the glue will wash out. And then I'm going to fold the edge up to the edge of my seam allowance. Finger press it, fold it one more time. You want to make sure you cover this seam that you have right here. There are very few things that I am super careful or specific about, but finishing techniques, I like them to look nice. And the tutorial was fabulous that went with this mask, but I was simply not capable of doing those folds at the sewing machine without the assistance of some type of pins or glue. So I came up with this method. I hope it's helpful for you. Once you get this finished and you've got your glue on it, let it dry. If you go directly to the sewing machine, you will gum up your sewing machine needle, and that will cause you more grief than you want to deal with. Let it dry. I've already glued these and they are ready for their top stitching. I've allowed the glue to dry. I have my thread saver right here. I'm going to sew to the end of it. Some people like to zigzag this. Some people continue to use a straight stitch. I find that if I move my stitching around on my sewing machine, I forget to put it back the way it's supposed to be. So I'm going to lift my presser foot because this is very thick and I don't want it to get distorted. And just look and see, it's not completely glued. It's just tacked in place. I'm going to come up here. This is a high stress area. I'm going to back tack. That means I'm going to make my sewing machine go backwards a few stitches. I'm going to sew down this edge. When I get here, I'm going to use this to make sure it doesn't go off. I'm going to leave my needle down. I'm going to pivot this piece. I didn't sew that far enough. I'm going to pivot this piece. I'm going to go back and take 3 stitches, and then I'm going to come back the opposite direction. This makes a really secure top stitch that will hold that elastic in there. That means at this point, when I get done with this seam, this piece of elastic has been sewn 4 times. When I get back to this end, I'm going to leave my needle down. I have that particular feature on this sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch, and then I'm going to back stitch, and then I'm going to come back again. Now it's a little bit hard to chain for this particular process, but all I have to really do is lift my presser foot and get that out of my way, and then I can pick up my next piece, lift my presser foot, and start again. Back, sew down. Get to the end, put your presser foot down. Again, my presser foot automatically goes down. I'm going to go ahead and snip this piece off because I'm doing I'm maneuvering on my machine, and it's a little easier to maneuver on the machine if you don't have pieces attached at the back. Again, I'm going to take about 3 stitches, and then I'm going to lift my presser foot again, and I'm going to sew back down. This is the 4th seam that the elastic has been sewn into. Get to this end, turn it again, back stitch, or back tack, and then I'll go to my next one. I move this to the back, I pick up the next one. Okay, so as I'm finishing up this last one, back tacking, now it's time to check my work. I'm going to sew onto my thread saver. Snip my thread, and I'm going to check and see what I did. Now, part of this top stitching here is structural, and part of it is for aesthetics. Top stitching makes things look finished. Now, because I have 2 layers of top stitching here, I know that my elastic is not going anywhere. It's been sewn down 4 times. And on the front, this is what I consider the front of this, this looks beautiful. Sometimes when you flip things over, they don't look quite as beautiful. So my first seam, it missed right there. Is that going to be a problem? That's a personal choice if you want to go and fix it or change it. But it is sewn down. It is not going anywhere. This particular seam has already been sewn down, so it's already sewn down once. And my second top stitching caught it. Over here, same. I missed it ever so slightly. So what that says to me is that maybe the next time I sew, I need to go in just a little further. Or I need to be a little more careful, because here's why it did that. Do you see how I did not quite line these up perfectly? That's a little bit of a problem for me personally. It's not a problem for the structure of this mask. This mask is not going to fall apart. Thank you so much for watching me go through some of the tips and tricks that I've discovered as I'm making the surgical masks for the Atlanta area hospitals. I appreciate you spending some time with me, and I hope that these tips and tricks are helpful to you as you're sewing masks for your friends, family, and hospitals in your local area. Thanks, and have a great day. Stay safe.